listener production.
A warning. This episode contains descriptions of violent crime, sexual assault, and crime scenes. Please listen with care. In 2006, Lee Patrick Torney, a former associate of Melbourne underworld figure Carl Williams, disappeared without a trace.
As with many of these cases, it's police-led information that takes the investigator to a particular area.
Almost a year later, forensic anthropologist Dr. Soren Blau was strapped into a harness and lowered into an abandoned mineshaft near the old gold mining village of Chewton.
In this mineshaft, when we were lowered down, there was a ledge where under that was a hole and then a drop, so that, the shaft went even further.
Among the dark and dust, she examined the secret clues hidden inside and on the surface of bones and documented their revelations about injuries and the circumstances of a death.
The deceased individual's skull was in fragments, and very much like a jigsaw puzzle, you can't see the picture until the fragments are reconstructed. And it was upon reconstruction that it was extremely clear that at the back of the deceased's head was a patterned injury. It tells me a lot about the fact that there's been quite a specific force that's been applied to the back of that person's head.
Soren also takes us inside a case that changed forensics forever. It began in a Welsh cemetery at midnight, with the first ever exhumation of a murder suspect in the United Kingdom. It ended with a serial killer being unmasked through another first in forensics, the use of familial DNA. My name's Liz Porter. I'm a journalist, true crime author, and forensic science obsessive. I've spent my career uncovering how forensic science cracks the toughest cases, writing 3 books on the subject and earning a PhD in the history of the Victoria Police Forensic Science Lab. Join me as I sit down with the world's top forensic experts and discover how forensic science is convicting the guilty and exonerating the innocent.
Paul Chewton and I, the forensic archaeologist, were standing in the hole. We were working under the tent, which was protection both from media but also the element. It was, minutes before midnight, and we were doing our expertise in the grave. And then just as we kind of used our trowel to reveal the nameplate of Cap'n, there was an almighty boom of thunder, and it really was like some setting out of a horror film.
So can you tell us a little bit about the Cap'n case, as this man was called?
Yes, this case is renowned or famous because it's the first case where familial DNA came into its own to basically identify what had been described as the Saturday Night Stranglers. So this was a case where 3 young people in the 1970s, so, significant time ago, had been raped and murdered. And while the scientists at the time had been able to retrieve DNA from the deceased, of course, the technology for DNA was, very ill-advanced. And so it's an extraordinary case for DNA scientists. I mean, that the amazing work of Colin Dark and Whitaker in terms of their just dogged time spent on trolling through. And a lot of this was done by hand to try to now use what had been created as a DNA database in the UK, and I believe it was about 1995. And so, basically the long and the short is that through some excellent policing, which again was around, you're in a small village in Wales, there'd been a lot of work done. The policing had narrowed it down to the fact that they were confident that the offender probably did come from the local village. And through a whole series of complicated, excellent policing plus the work of the DNA, they were able to narrow this case down to the fact that they believed that by getting a DNA sample from Mr. Cap'n, so Joe Cap'n was the deceased person that we exhumed, they felt confident that they would be able to then compare his DNA to DNA that they had obtained from these poor victims. And in fact, that was the case. But I guess the real key in this is the notion of familial DNA, so that the way they had got to that was the fact that Joe's son had committed a crime, and therefore his DNA was recorded on a database. And it's an extraordinary set of, triangulation to, as I say, lead to a request for a warrant. And ultimately, they did find that Joe Capham was the offender.
Now, I gather you were also working pretty much in the middle of a media circus. They had decided to start at midnight, which sounds crazy, except they only had one day, I think.
That's right. So under the British legal system, in order to do an exhumation, it requires legal authority. So that authorisation is provided, and it usually, in the UK, it comes with a time period. So in this case, there were 24 hours. So, it just happened, and I think probably I don't know the details, but I imagine that because of the high profile nature of the case, there was also a timing issue to try to avoid media. There was a large tent erected over the area of interest with all our equipment, and obviously that was to screen out public interest and also media.
But they were there waiting around.
They were, yes.
So what was actually involved?
Our role as forensic experts was to do an exhumation, and we'd been told that the person of interest was buried second under. So you'll be aware in cemeteries you may be first buried, but you also might be one or two or three down, depending on the age of the cemetery. We'd been briefed about the fact that because the deceased person that we were aiming to exhume was second under, we needed, of course, to first respectfully locate the first burial, confirm the name of that person, to make sure we were in the right spot, and ultimately be guided to seek and define the second coffin and confirm that nameplate. So I say that because often working in cemeteries, there are cemetery plans, but they're not always correct. And so, it's really the role of a forensic archaeologist to be efficient and, use their techniques to do that as quickly and as efficiently as possible.
You removed the first coffin, got that out of the way. You got to the second coffin.
Yes. We don't always know, for example, what the coffin's made of. We had a passage of time, remembering that the individual of interest had been interred for 12 years. And so there's no guarantees that the name of the coffin will be intact and that the coffin lid will also be intact. And so the idea of the archaeology anthropologist is to use their skills to ensure that there is as little damage to the coffin, and if the lid is broken, then to obviously describe and report that, because ultimately the aim of this exhumation was to recover this individual to obtain a DNA sample. And so the issue was, A, to confirm the name, which we were able to do in a timely manner, that the coffin name on the coffin plate was still intact, and then to ensure that the lid was intact and that no one from the first burial, for example, no bones had potentially gone through to the second, which they had not.
You didn't examine the bones at the time?
No, correct. So the idea was because of the quest for DNA, it was much more appropriate to ensure that the deceased person is examined and sampled in a mortuary environment. So the entire coffin was lifted. Still a fascinating case for me, and I still use this when I present lectures because of the preservation. The coffin was very well intact, the lid was removed, and the deceased individual his suit was still very well intact, plastic shoes, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, fascinating given he was buried, 2 coffins under and had been in the ground for 12 years.
As you say, it was all done by hand and eye. These days we have computer programs to look for family resemblances and key unusual alleles on the DNA molecule. But in those days they didn't.
Correct. It's extraordinary to think about it now. I think those of us who are involved, in missing person cases or, large-scale investigations, I don't think we can even imagine, which is why I take my hat off to the DNA scientists at the time.
And it was extraordinary police work. Finally, at the time, it was an absolute mess, again, because they didn't have computers. They had too much information and too many suspects. But as you say, unlike on TV shows, you didn't know at the time how important this case was. It was only afterwards
Correct.
that you were told.
The coffin was taken back to a mortuary, and for Paul and myself as the forensic archaeologist and anthropologist, that's really where our role stopped. It was then examined by a forensic pathologist and samples taken. I mean, it was a privilege, obviously, to be in the mortuary, as I said, to observe the preservation and, of course, realise that the sampling for DNA was not going to be an issue.
But it wasn't your job to actually break into the bone and
Correct.
take out the DNA?
No, neither Paul or I were involved in the sampling for DNA.
So that's a job for a DNA expert to
Well, yes, it's an interesting question. In that case, yes. In my role now, it's very much the case that forensic anthropologists are involved in the examination of deceased persons to then select the appropriate skeletal or dental element for DNA. So that is a shift, and it does depend on the context. This was a long time ago. I think forensic anthropology, as I said, was very much in its infancy. Certainly that sort of work fell to either the forensic pathologist and or the DNA scientist. But increasingly now in my role as forensic anthropologist, work very closely with DNA scientists, but mostly it's the forensic anthropologist who's working in the mortuary.
And you knew beforehand that there were 3 sets of remains in this grave. You were hoping, as it turned out, that the coffins would be intact. But you were also prepared, I gather, that they might not have been intact and you would have had possibly 3 sets of commingled remains?
Yes, that is possible. I've certainly undertaken a number of exhumations where you get, a number of problems. For example, rising groundwater in a cemetery can lead to, obviously, the destruction of the coffin. That has an impact also on the deceased person and the likelihood of getting DNA. Of course, technology has improved significantly. So in terms of planning for an exhumation, as a forensic archaeologist or anthropologist, we do quite a lot of background work before we even go to the cemetery. We're interested in the cemetery plan, as I mentioned. How accurate is that plan? In some cases, people are buried in areas that are actually unmarked for various complicated reasons. We're interested in the soil type. The soil type has an impact potentially on the preservation of the coffin, but most importantly, of course, the human remains and ultimately what the forensic anthropologist can say about that person, and then, ultimately going down to the success of extraction of DNA. So it really does depend on the case, on the question. But as I said, as was the case in Wales, because we were working on the second coffin, it was important to what's called shore up the edges. It's an occupational health safety issue. We don't want the sides of the grave falling in as you work. So shoring is something that cemetery diggers do all the time, and often in exhumations we work very closely with cemetery diggers. They're very, very experienced. A cemetery digger, for example, will often use a machine to literally use the excavator to take off the top before the more, I'd say, delicate work of the forensic archaeologist actually hopping in the hole.
But you have the skills from your experience as someone who's worked on war crimes that if all the bones had been commingled, you still would have been able to do your archaeological jigsaw puzzle and assemble 3 sets of remains.
Yes, it's very much the role of the forensic anthropologist to confirm that there is evidence of what we call commingling, as you've said, where the remains of one individual might be mixed in, commingled with 2, 3, 4, possibly hundreds, depending on the context. And then using an understanding of, it might be anatomy, it might be the age or sex of the person, depending on the body area. It might be differences, as we know, between what we call gracile, so quite slight, versus a very robust person. It might be pathology. It might be individual traits, et cetera, to separate those individuals. Sometimes it is impossible. So that's where we then go to DNA sampling to help what we call reassociate skeletal or body parts with the whole.
What is something that the public most often misunderstands about forensic anthropology and exhumations for that matter?
Probably the biggest misnomer about forensic anthropology is the speed at which the examination and ultimately the results occur. As we know, we watch bone or silence witness and everything happens in 35 minutes or 40 minutes. Certainly not the case. Often, depending on the complexity, as I've mentioned, a whole lot of variables that might make the case and the recovery and therefore the examination complex, that may take days, weeks, it really depends. And I think the other misnomer is that forensic experts, whether you're a forensic archaeologist, a forensic anthropologist, a geneticist, nobody works in isolation. The entire process is a team event, including the investigators, so the police agencies, and that I don't think is borne out very well in television shows. Usually the beautiful forensic anthropologist saves the day. So that's, that is a misnomer. I think probably the other misnomer is that forensic anthropologists only work on sort of high-profile cases. I mean, our role and responsibility is to examine any evidence of remains that are thought to be human in the first instance and provide information ultimately to families or to the court.
What drew you to forensic anthropology in the first place?
Well, when I went to university, I really wasn't very clear as to what I would study. I did an arts degree, and during that arts degree, I studied archaeology and French. And the archaeology I studied at that time was fairly what I would describe as dry. There was a lot of slides of Greek pots, and while there was fascination there, I was relatively young and decided that I would take a year off studying archaeology and go and, actually do some real work. So I deferred from my university course and travelled overseas and had the opportunity to work on archaeological sites. At that time, I visited Israel and I worked at a site called Bashan, which is one of the sort of most well-preserved Roman sites in Israel, dating back, to the 3rd millennium. And it was a fascinating experience. It was just completely fortuitous that during the excavation, we came across human remains. And I think that really, for me, was a pivotal moment. And while, we didn't at that time get the opportunity to remain on the site to excavate the remains, I think something was very much opened in my mind about the, fascination of the fact that human remains survive. And for me, that was far more interesting than, the pots and the gold.
And at that point already, did you know that you could tell how someone had died by looking at their bones?
Not in great detail. At that time in Australia, you could, of course, study medicine. So, medical students studied the hard tissue. That wasn't something I really wanted to pursue. And at the University of Sydney, where I was studying, there really wasn't anything around forensic at that time. I therefore did some research and did find a course overseas in the mid-90s, and I was very fortunate to win a scholarship to go and study overseas. So it was a 1-year master's degree, which really gave me the foundations for understanding what a person can say when we're studying the human skeleton.
And was that course actually called a forensic anthropology course?
It was actually a master's in paleopathology. So what that means is we're looking at the human skeleton to understand the types of diseases that leave their mark on the human skeleton. But in order to do that, one has to also then be able to comment on, for example, the estimation of the person's age, their biological sex, and anything else that we know might influence how disease impacts on the skeleton. So I was also in an area where colleagues teaching that course were very much providing information and expertise to police. So that also was a kind of opening for my extended interest in forensic anthropology.
And your first job to do with the police was in Canberra, wasn't it?
I was sort of fascinated by trying to work out how to pursue this career. As I said, there was no direct pathway. Because I had the opportunity, while I was at the University of Sydney, I had a small fellowship to the Australian National University where there were some experts at the time with also great knowledge of the human skeleton. So I did a little internship at the ANU And at that time, I then sort of linked to I did give some courses to police that came to the Canberra Institute of Technology. So, it was very, very early days. I think, there were no established courses at that time. So, I was really sort of trying to create opportunities.
Let's go forward to 2002. And at that point, you're living in the UK. You have quite a big job in a university in archaeology. Can you explain?
When I finished my PhD, I was fortunate enough to obtain a lectureship position at Bournemouth University, and I was heading up what they call their Forensic Archaeology and Anthropology Master's course. So that was, again, a wonderful opportunity. I was very much learning as I was teaching, which I think is a good thing to do. And one of the important things at that time and continues for me is that when we teach, we're also informing teaching through practice. So wherever there was the opportunity to go and, be involved in casework, I very much took that opportunity. I was very much the junior in that department, and my colleagues were, very, very experienced.
In 2006, you were lowered into a disused mine shaft near the town of Chewton in Victoria. What were you doing there?
So the request came from Victoria Police, who were investigating the disappearance of a career gangster. As with many of these cases, it's police-led information that, takes the investigator to a particular area. In this case in Chewton, the forensic pathologist, Malcolm Dodd, and I were asked to attend that scene because the scene involved a mine shaft. So as you can imagine, this is not a deceased person in what I would perhaps describe as a controlled environment such as a cemetery. These are, it was a relatively deep shaft, and the allegation was that the victim had been disposed of down this mine shaft. So as a forensic anthropologist, my role was to enter into that mine shaft and to do a recovery, which is part of our everyday business.
And the body or skeleton that was expected to be there was a guy called Lee Patrick Torney, who was an associate of Carl Williams, who is, of course, a famous name in Melbourne at least because of the gangland wars. How deep was the mine shaft? So how far down were you lowered?
I can't remember the exact depth, but I do remember that we had to work with SES to, do the descent in a proper and safe manner. So it wasn't just a ladder propped up against the edge. As you can imagine, a mine shaft is, relatively deep. What I do recall is that in this mine shaft, there was, when we were lowered down, there was a ledge where confirmed the presence of human remains, but then under that was a hole and then a drop, so that, the shaft went even further. And that was significant because once we'd recovered the deceased remains and we were back in the mortuary, it was clear that we did not have all of, for example, the individual's head. And I think that can be accounted for this very fact that probably the fragments had fallen through this gap.
Why was it so important that a forensic anthropologist rather than a crime scene officer do this job?
It's a very good question and something I talk about a lot. In this case, you have a number of variables. So probably the most significant one is time. So the time in which Mr. Torney was last seen was about 1.5 years ago. So we've got a passage of time. We've also got an environment where it's not, for example, typical burial. We're not in bushland. So, there was an expectation that the deceased would not look like a recently deceased person. And I always argue that you have to know what you're looking for in order to recover appropriately and give the most detailed answers. So that is why a crime scene officer, even though they're very good at crime scene examination, when it comes to the recovery of deceased persons, when we have variables such as a passage of time, we've got environmental variables impacting on the body, really the role of the forensic anthropology in these cases is critical.
So then you take the remains back to the Institute of Forensic Medicine. What happens then?
We would look at estimating the age, death of the individual, the biological sex, potentially the ancestry, again, depending on the context. in this case, because of the information provided by police that there had been a crime committed, we're also looking for evidence of any impact, defects, trauma to that individual.
You described at the time seeing clear tool marks on the skull fragments. What are the clues in bone trauma that help you distinguish a weapon injury from, for example, a fall?
The first step is to describe the preservation of the remains, because what we're doing is identifying potential defects, then moving on to an interpretation as to whether that defect is a result, for example, of the environment. It might be scavenging, or is it actually evidence of some kind of force that's impacted on the individual? Now, the issue of a fall is interesting because, as you can imagine, you could have someone that jumps intentionally or that is pushed. Both of those involve a blunt force, so they fall. So for a forensic anthropologist, we can comment on blunt force, but we cannot, of course, say in that instance whether that was intentional or not. So in this case, what was interesting is that the deceased individual's skull was in fragments, and very much like a jigsaw puzzle, you can't see the picture until the fragments are reconstructed. So a role of the forensic anthropologist is to carefully reconstruct and document that reconstruction. And it was upon reconstruction that it was extremely clear that at the back of the deceased's head was described as a patterned injury. So that pattern tells me a lot about the fact that there's been quite a specific force that's been applied to the back of that person's head. In this case, it was, long, linear. It had a certain width. I'm not going to, and nor should a forensic anthropologist, comment on this was created by a specific tool. However, in this case, it was put to me in court, could this have been created by a shovel or spade? To which, of course, the answer is yes, because of the particular patterning that this force had imprinted in the deceased's head.
What made you confident that the trauma had happened peri-mortem, which means around the time of death? Why is that detail so crucial in a murder investigation?
So the term peri-mortem has caused a lot of grief for forensic anthropologists in court. You're absolutely correct. It means around the time of death, but often in court I explain that the term peri-mortem for a forensic pathologist, for example, who is dealing with soft tissue, actually means something different. For a forensic anthropologist, we can only comment on the bone, the hard tissue. So for us, peri-mortem refers to a time when the skeletal structures are still what we describe as fresh. So I use the analogy of a tree. So, for example, a fresh tree branch, if you bend that as a fresh branch, it reacts quite differently because it's fresh, green, and we also use that term in for bone. If the tree branch is completely dried out and has been there for many years, when you bend it, it snaps, it breaks differently. So too does the human skeleton. If the bone has lost its moisture content, that is, the person's been deceased for a very long time, that will behave differently, even if, the remains are scavenged or something falls on the deceased. The complexity for the discipline is that period of peri-mortem is very broad. So it may be weeks, it could be months, depending on the environment in which the person's been disposed of or buried. It might be the age of the person, whether they were taking drugs. And that's why this importance of the scene and the description of the entire environment is so critical.
You, in theory, might not be able to tell the difference between somebody who clouted a dead body on the head, that and the situation of somebody being clouted on the head and them falling into the mineshaft alive.
Correct. And that is exactly the complexity in many of these cases. What we can say is that, this is a patterned, in this case, in the Torney case, pattern defect that requires an impact by a patterned object, an object with form. Whether that happened when Mr. Torney was alive, whether Mr. Torney had a heart attack, whether Mr. Torney was shot, and I'm not saying there was any evidence of that, but sometimes we know that people can be shot. There's no evidence on the skeleton, soft tissue decomposes, then the person's struck. And there lies the complexity for forensic anthropology.
But police did have some kind of information that he had in fact been
correct,
clouted on the head and sent hurtling into the mineshaft.
That's exactly right. And this is why the police investigation, I go back to, this really is teamwork, and the information provided to the forensic expert is critical. Now, when that information is provided is also important. We know there's lots of discussion now about bias. Forensic anthropologists should do their examination just with the information. But of course, that detail is critical to then addressing the question, is it possible that Mr. Torney was struck with a shovel or a spade? Yes, it is possible. Why? Well, because the width and the form of the patterned injury is very in line with the shape and form of said shovel spade.
So these days, with all that awareness of contextual bias, are you given the police scenario information immediately or later after you've done some kind of initial?
It really depends, Liz. And I think, we speak a lot, I think, academically about what would be best practice, but we know that, and no disrespect to police, often they're very keen to say, well, the missing person's there's a female, elderly female, and what do you think of that skull? So, you cannot now be biased when you're looking at this skull to think, oh, elderly female. So, this is difficult, but, part of our responsibility now as professionals when we write the report is in fact now to be overt. I was told by policeman X prior to examination that the missing person was an elderly female. So you've been overt about the fact that there potentially is bias. I mean, that's obviously a made-up example. More weight perhaps is these cases where there's issues of alleged violence to an individual. So how you get information and when and how we record that is absolutely critical to ensure that the evidence and opinions we give are, suitable and appropriate.
Well, thank you so much, Soren. And also next time I need help with a jigsaw, you're the one.
Thanks, Liz.
Crime Insiders Forensics is hosted by me, Liz Porter. It's produced by Holly Mitchell, Jade Murray and Dan Mullins. Sound design is by Niall Fernandez. This podcast is produced on Wurundjeri and Gadigal lands.